Go.
Nice.
That helps me align the tracks.
I believe you. I'm all for it. Go. I thought we were breaking. There was a play and I missed it.
That's right. No plays. No plays.
No plays.
How are you, Mark?
I am well, thanks. And you?
I am well as well.
Glad to hear it. Mm-hmm. Yes. So what's the status of your kingdom this morning?
It's a mighty but small one.
Welcome to How I See It with me, Mark Pratt, and
Justin Sternberg. This is a podcast that works to counter cultural polarization through thoughtful conversations. Yeah, so
how's that for a transition?
That's I'll give it a C plus.
Yeah, it wasn't much of a transition.
It was something.
It was quick.
We're talking about the kingdom today. And what does that mean for, really believers, people who are trying to live for the kingdom of God. Or, there's so many ways we say that. Living for God is just an example that people say, or, being a light on the hill, salt of the earth, those kinds of things. There's lots of metaphors that the Bible uses for this, but uniquely, we're going to speak of the idea of the kingdom, his kingdom, and, other ones, right?
Sure. Thinking on that, and when you think of his kingdom, our kingdom, how often would you say you reflect on yourself, whether you're part of a kingdom or in your own realm? How often do you reflect on that for you personally?
I feel like I would say somewhat often, but I feel like it comes up in my mind a lot when we do this podcast, and I feel like we've even referenced that. What?
Speaking of that, we forgot to pray this morning. But yeah. But I guess that's the part that comes to my mind, is how often do we actually think about ourselves as being part of an operational kingdom with a king, right, with us being servants, and that it's just a thought that crosses my mind in that process, because I think we can lose sight of that. I know I can, I can lose sight of that at times. And recognize that, okay, this is a unique thought. Yeah.
That's a good question. I'd like to turn back to you. Like, is this a personal point of, devotion, right? Like kind of a thought that comes to mind for you. And what kinds of things trigger those thoughts for you?
I think, for me, definitely in the morning, I am aware that I want to start the day. If I'm recognizing that I'm a servant of God in this greater kingdom for his good, there is that part of me that seeks to spend time with him each morning in such a way that seeks the direction for his life. And sometimes I'll go so far as to, write that down in my journal that, you're king, you reign in my personal life today. You're king. I desire to do what you would have me to do. And that's a part of my, kind of daily morning routine that tries to keep that perspective in mind. But I'll admit, I wasn't going to say I'm not able. As of yet, I'm not always willing to hold on to that throughout the entire day. Yeah. And I think, that's the part that I think is, and I think it's going to be different for everyone, because some people, if I may say, of course, some people aren't even going to acknowledge that there is such a thing. Right. As the spiritual realm, this kingdom. But for me personally, I recognize it. It's a matter of how I go about holding on to it, or I go about recognizing his kingdom versus the kingdom that I desire to build here on earth, which I believe, what we do here on earth can have great impact on the greater kingdom of God. But it's just I will call it a wrestling, if you will, that I, fall in and out of throughout the process of a day. And depending on how busy my day is, depending on where I'm at in my day, where I'm working, what I'm doing, I think it makes it easier or harder based on my circumstances. What about you?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think, similarly for me, in the sense that when it comes to acknowledging and recognizing that a lot of my prayers are selfish prayers, and ultimately I want what's right for the kingdom versus my kingdom or whatever. So that's I think that's a pretty common theme for me in the quiet time that I have. I also think it makes me think a lot about quote unquote celebrities, Christian celebrities even, and I recently listened to the Fall of Mars Hill podcast, which is just a really excellent podcast, kind of talking about the whole Mars Hill thing and Mark Driscoll's kind of influence over just so many people. And a lot of what he did in the name of God's kingdom, right?
Okay, sure.
And there was a lot of fallout and a lot of pain. And I also, I look at that whole situation from, the opposite coast a decade later or whatever, a different perspective, and just say, like, I think God uses, fallible people to do his infallible work.
Sure.
And so I do see his kingdom was grown through that movement.
Sure.
And there's undeniable proof of that. I also see a lot of fallout and a lot of pain and damage. And the truth is, had God brought some of those people to a different church, let's say the same number of people were brought into his kingdom or became aware of his kingdom or, decided to finally start doing something about his kingdom, right? Through 50 different churches instead of the one, I kind of wonder how many of them would have fallout at this point anyway, because we're human and every institution is full of humans, and the church is a non-negotiable in God's kingdom, and yet it is full of fallible people messing up all the time. And what the Bible says is that he's going to maintain his church through all of history, because if he didn't, we would destroy it. We've tried so many times, right? Like we've built monstrosities we call church, and then they fall apart, and a new generation comes in and replaces it. You think of Martin Luther, you think about, the Reformation, that whole thing. You think about even when the Catholic Church was built in the beginning, right? That was kind of the initial growth of a big version of the church, right? A kingdom. And you think about the various denominations that have come out over time as they say, you know what, the churches that exist are not speaking to this specific thing well enough. So we need to start a new church that focuses on that tenet, whatever that is. Right? It's baptism for Baptists or whatever, and there are other things. Let
alone the tendency to go to a non-denominational that tends to throw all of that away, not away, but, desire to disregard much of that in such a way that says, okay, we don't want to be about that one thing quite so much.
Yeah. And I would think most non-denominational churches would say, no, we are about the one thing that matters, right? We're getting back to the core of what matters. Now, every non-denominational church has its own flavor and its own bent and has its own specific, missions and all that. And so they do focus on things specifically, whether it's part of their creed or not. But yeah, thinking of all of those things and Mark Driscoll, it just gets a little fuzzy in terms of it's, and then you think about the verses that talk about stewardship, right?
Okay, sure.
And there's this parable that Jesus tells where the master leaves a sum of money in 3 different servants' hands, right?
Sure.
And he goes away for a period of time, several years.
Yep.
Then comes back and says, okay, what'd you do with the money I gave you? And one servant said, well, I buried it so no one could steal it. And here it is right back to you. And the next one said, well, I risked a little bit and I basically doubled your money, And the third one said, well, 10x, 5x, something like that. His money. And of course the reward was for the greater risk. And the one that simply buried it out of fear was essentially, bashed for it, or, sure. Punished. Yeah. And so there's this idea in the Bible that we are meant to take what he's given us, the talents. And I think it's kind of interesting how, the wording, the use of the word, kind of played out over history, where talents in the Bible was a literal form of currency. Sure. Back in, I guess, maybe King James time, I don't know,
a while ago,
or at some point there was a word called talents used for a sum of money,
like a shekel or any other form of currency. Sure.
But it's interesting how over the years in English, talents also represents our talents,
our
right?
Abilities.
Our abilities, Sure. And so that metaphor just really works nicely for people, English speakers, right? It's like, exactly. Oh, talents, We're not supposed to waste our talents, you know? We're not supposed to bury them. We're supposed to use them and leverage them. And I think that, I guess, wrapping it all back into the personal kingdom, I think there's an aspect to taking what he's given us and leveraging it. The key in that story was one was afraid and didn't do anything with it, and the others, doubled or tripled or whatever. But they did it to double his money, not to somehow skim off the top or build their personal kingdom. It was about, I want to do with my master's money what is best for him. Sure. And so I think it can be fuzzy, but I don't think it has to be.
So help me understand that. In our modern day dynamic, as you see investing, not in investing as you look at investing your talents. Yeah. Where would you say, if I might, where is that line drawn for you personally as far as leverage? We can think of leverage as the ability to lift something we wouldn't be able to lift by ourselves, but then we can also, I think leveraging can almost have a negative connotation. Yeah. Depending on almost a use of. Yeah. Where would you say that line is drawn? How do you draw that line personally in that leveraging dynamic?
Well, I think it kind of comes back to where we started, which was, what do you do to remember the kingdom, Mark? What do I, I would say if that thought rarely crosses your mind, there's, or my mind, there's a chance I'm kind of missing that. And probably leveraging what he's given me for my own kingdom. Is that fair? I don't know. But as far as where do you draw the line?
Because I'm thinking of the Mark Driscoll type dynamic. What is too far? In other words, I recognize we're fallible, and so therefore, I think of it in a context of zeal. A person can be so zealous that they lose sight of how their desire tends to minimize the value of people. And I'm not sure that's a healthy part of God's kingdom. But yet I think we can get so zealous at times that we lose sight of that. I even think of Paul, and his not consuming, but his transformation. He said, basically that persecuting, that's the word I was looking for, persecuting, early Christians was something he did zealously. And yet he recognized kingdom. Yes, yes, for his original viewpoint of kingdom. And then when his transformation, when he was blinded, that kind of thing by the light, that transformed. And I guess that's where I'm thinking of it. It's like, okay, I think for me, it does come down to a daily reflection, because I can admit I can get caught up in building my kingdom here on earth. And I'm not saying people who are more spiritual than I can't necessarily build their kingdom on earth in a way that completely glorifies God's kingdom. Mm-hmm. But I think there are, in our humanness, that's something we need to be mindful of. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's where I'm just thinking about it, because at times even if we look back at David, he built a kingdom, but then he went to the point of his kingdom. He grew his kingdom to the point that it was about his comfort. He was no longer working in service, and therefore it was another member of his kingdom, Bathsheba, if you will, as in his moment of, hey, I need to take a break. I've built this kingdom. I'm going to stay back and just kind of enjoy this. And that was part of his downfall where Bathsheba was concerned. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's where I'm thinking about it, to serve the kingdom well from a lifetime perspective. Mm-hmm. And I think even as Americans, we can definitely come into this, okay, I've been given these talents in a work environment, occupationally, but yet at times my goal can be to reach retirement, and I'm going to take a break. And I think at times we can lose influence at that point, because it's about, okay, I've achieved it, or even the man in the Bible who talks about building a bigger barn. And I guess that's this kind of stuff that's coming to my mind, is how do we continue to create or build God's kingdom with God's help? I think that's a part of it too, that it's not us doing it alone for our glory. Yeah. And yet I think in our humanness, we can get caught up in that comfort, if you will. That's just as we're walking through this morning, I guess that's a little bit now you can bring it back and bring some clarity to that, as I've just kind of.
Well, you definitely made me think of a couple things, but the bigger barn thing, that parable is, I'm going to try and paraphrase it, and you correct me where I get it wrong, but essentially I think it's this idea that this man was given some talents in the terms of some assets. Maybe it was he inherited some good assets. I don't know. Maybe he's just a good, shrewd businessman or whatever. Sure. And he got to the point where he said, man, this little kingdom I'm building is working out pretty well. What I need to do next is build this really big storehouse to store all my goodies. And you would think that doesn't sound like a bad thing. Like, save, there's a lot of principles in there that I think can get confused with other good principles. But essentially what I think the parable is talking about is this idea that I'm going to build my kingdom, and God, you do your thing, I'm going to do my thing. And essentially saying, I'm going to do this regardless of whatever God's plans are. And he said, good luck with that. Essentially, like, we don't have that option to disregard God's kingdom, because his supersedes ours. And if you do things without regard for his kingdom, there's a very good chance that you'll start becoming misaligned, and the principles of his truth will start working against you. That was kind of my take of that. Sure. Parallel.
It's to the point of basically, okay, I've from that person's viewpoint, I've built this up. I'm going to build the next one even bigger, and then I'll just be able to kick back and enjoy the rest of my life.
Yeah, and the other thing I was thinking about too is, you were saying, how do you keep from going over the line? And basically, I think one thing that is comforting for me is that there is no line that will mess up God's kingdom.
Okay.
In that, you can look at this whole Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill thing and go, well, clearly there is, because that, disenfranchised a lot of people, so the word deconstructing our faith, that's that kind of came out of that movement, is this idea of getting back to the fundamentals and or discarding it, right? And so I definitely think that there's some fallout there, but I also believe that there was a very large move of God where people came to him through the ministries of that church, and B, the fallout is not the end of the story.
Sure.
And, I've been involved in Celebrate Recovery for so many years and hearing testimony after testimony, every other week, right? Just so many opportunities, seeing so many opportunities where God turned, ashes into beauty and fallout into, a new structure, a new thing, you know what I mean? And so I guess I'm not worried about that part. And some people might be like, what's wrong with you or whatever. I'm just saying, like, I've seen enough proof to know that God can use the garbage stuff to then
what we call garbage.
Yeah. To turn into beauty. And so so all that being said, like, in terms of how do I not cross the line and mess up his kingdom, I guess I'm not worried about messing up his kingdom. I'm just worried about missing the boat.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Like, I want to be part of that kingdom because that is the forever kingdom. That's, and that's what he's called us to. We are citizens of that kingdom. If I go off and do my own thing, build my storehouses and retire, like, that boat's going to keep moving and I won't be on it. Now, I don't think that translates into, salvation, and I lost my salvation and I won't make it to heaven. I think it just kind of it's like burying the talents he gave me and sitting on them, and versus using the leverage that he's given me.
And I guess that's where I'm coming from. I'm not, for me, I guess if I was answering my own question on the line, I think there would be an aspect of sensitivity to that.
Yeah. Being aware that it could happen.
That it's a possibility. And that, because I think when I reflect on, my kingdom, and I think at times I would dare say my kingdom can be in conflict with God's kingdom, even if I don't necessarily recognize it. Because I think when I think about God and his kingdom, he's a good king. And therefore, what he provides is sufficient for me daily. You follow me in that context? And I think when my mind starts shifting, I start thinking about my provision, providing for myself for years to come. Kind of like the guy with the barn. It's about self-sufficiency. At that point versus
and preservation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm starting to think about, the obstacles in life and recognizing, how can I insulate myself from those things? And how can I predict the market, if you will, in such a way that I can just continue to maintain this lifestyle indefinitely.
Yeah.
Until I run out of energy.
Yeah.
And I think that's where, I guess that's where I would use that line dynamic is where does that shift? How does that become part of my thinking that I transition from this, God, every day is your bread is given to me, to this point of, no, God, you go over there. I got this from here and I can provide myself indefinitely, and you just take care of other people. Not that I would want to go there, but you understand it. I guess I see that as a possibility, and I want to be mindful of that.
Yeah. Well, even in that parable, I think he provides an answer after, right? Like, he said, when you make these plans, say, if the Lord wills, right? Something like that.
I think that's more of the, I'm thinking of the, is it Peter or Timothy, where he's talking about go here and make some money. And that's where it says, and the next part is, no, you should say, if it's the Lord's will, we'll go here and we'll do this, because what is your life but a vapor? I think it's 1 Peter 4:17 in that range. Don't quote me on that.
Yeah.
But it's, who are you and what is your life? You're but a vapor.
Yeah.
And it's the person that doesn't do what he knows he should do that is sin. You follow me? And I think the parable is about, it kind of ends in that part, you fool you. You think but your very life may be taken from you tomorrow.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And it's like, it's still kind of that vapor dynamic, but I think those are a little bit separate from my perspective.
Yeah, I couldn't remember, but thank you.
Yeah.
And if there's any fact checkers listening, you can fix all of our Bible references. But the principles are there, right? And this idea that,
yes,
you planning your own kingdom is not guaranteed to succeed. It's also not guaranteed to fail, and that's not what the point of the parable was. It was just separation from what he's doing is. The other thing I was thinking about too with the Mark Driscoll thing, I think it was I want to say it was Paul.
Okay.
And they said, these other people are preaching in Jesus' name. What should we do about them? He said, well, if they're, for us, they're not against us, right? That kind of idea. And he wasn't willing to declassify them to say, no, they're not acceptable preachers of the gospel because X, Y, or Z. He said, well, they preaching for Jesus. Okay, then they're okay by me.
Sure.
And, it's cool to kind of see that example right in the Bible in the sense to recognize that Mark Driscoll said and did a ton of things wrong, but there's also a lot of people that heard the gospel and came to Jesus because of his preaching. And again, there's some fallout there, but I think that the number of souls that will go to heaven as a result of that ministry, I don't know about the end justifying the means, but I certainly am glad that those souls have an eternal destination in heaven versus the alternative, right?
Yeah, and I think about it in the context you shared. I think it was the disciples as they were, these people are going about doing this, and using your name,
Yeah.
And I think unfortunately in our humanness we can think of the kingdom in a very territorial way. To the point that I'm doing the real work for God's kingdom and what you're doing isn't part of it. But I think from my true perspective is what you do for the kingdom is what God's calling you to do. And I think you need to be about that, even if it's different than the talents that I've been given to use in such a way. And I think, that's what makes us ministers of the gospel to a certain degree is when we all take our talents and all of our occupational dynamics and we use that to glorify the kingdom. Because I think we can be kind of territorial or even hierarchical, if you will, that what I'm doing is more important than what you're doing.
Because we want to sit next to Jesus. The brothers, John and...
Yeah, the two brothers there, the sons of Zebedee.
The mom's like, can we get these guys to sit next to you in heaven?
Yeah, one at your right and one at your left.
We're all kind of doing that, I think.
At times.
Yeah.
And I like, I was thinking about it a little more as you mentioned the fear dynamic, where I was asking about the line, and I think that is connected because I think we can be so fearful about like the lesser servant who was given one talent, we just take it and bury it.
Yeah.
And I think there is something to be said for, what is it? It's bold prayers honor God and God honors bold prayers. That aspect of him knowing our heart in this process of going forward. And yet we aren't going to do it perfectly.
Right.
And yet I don't believe he's calling us to do it perfectly. He's just calling us to go forward in faith, recognizing that, there will be, I believe we all have our Mark Driscoll moments, if you will. the thing that made Mars Hill what it was because it was such a large kingdom, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And that drew attention, in our current cultural marketplace.
Yeah, large kingdom with the loud king.
Yes. And I think, there again, kind of like you said about the 50 churches, I think that happens on a smaller scale quite often.
Yeah.
And we're just unaware of it.
Yeah. A very common kind of historical trauma for a lot of believers has to do with trauma in the church and different things. That's not uncommon.
Right.
It's more common. It's painfully common, right?
Sure.
Where people were hurt in the church and as a result carry around wounds the rest of their life. Mm-hmm. Because we're just stinking human and we mess up. And like you said, we're about doing our part for the kingdom. And sometimes we're trying to do our part on smashing others out of the way. And sometimes, like you said, critiquing, we're on both sides of the wall, building the wall of the kingdom. And we point at the other one and go, look at him.
Yeah.
He doesn't know how to build a wall. He's putting on the whatever wrong. And instead of doing our job and focusing on that, we're, tearing down others or comparing or competition. Like, oh, he's pretty quick at building a wall. I think I can go build a little bit quicker and a little bit better. And
yeah.
I think the master will approve of mine a little bit better, even though his is okay. I think I can do, like we do that. We're humans.
Is there a competition in the kingdom?
Well, I would say no, but I definitely think we feel that. Because it's our flesh, right? Our flesh is the thing that kind of makes the kingdom messy. Yeah. The kingdom as it is on this earth, which is why Jesus said you should pray that this earth will be like the kingdom in heaven, right? Like as things are in heaven, that they'll be that way on earth. In other words, our flesh is settled. Right.
And I think it is that. I know it's not First Peter. I know that verse in First Peter, so I know the other one wasn't First Peter, but still that, that humbling of ourselves is what minimizes or makes our ability to cast our anxieties. And I think competition becomes a part of that.
Yeah.
Anxiety. It's like, am I doing it as good as someone else?
Mm-hmm.
But when I'm able to humble myself to a certain degree, and recognize this isn't about my kingdom, it's about God's kingdom, and what you're doing is just as valuable as what I'm doing, that takes away that anxiety.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important part and that's where I guess where I'm asking for us. I think we can get so caught up in productivity from our perspective, and we lose, and we can be more about the 99 than the one. Mm-hmm. You follow me? Mm-hmm. It's more the numbers. The numbers become so important when we get caught up in the competition dynamic. You follow?
No, that's a great point. And obviously, the parable about Jesus going to get the one and leaving the 99 shows that he cares about the individual.
Yeah.
More, if not more, as much as the collective, right?
Yeah.
And I think the idea there is that the collective will take care of itself. Obviously, in the spiritual realm, God's got that and the one. Like,
sure, he has both.
He has all power, but I think just his display of care for the individual is, I think, meant to be a model. And with kind of to your point, like we're not meant to be hurting the one in order to, gain the 99. But I kind of want to, so if you don't mind, I kind of want to transition this from this idea of church ministry, theology, people in churches, into like, what does this mean for real life and for Bob, who goes to work at the steel mill, and for me, I'm a web developer / manager, that kind of thing. Like, how does this tie into real life? And if I'm out here, building houses, am I missing the boat? Am I not, building his kingdom? I'm building a literal house, so I don't have time to build his kingdom. In other words, I'm not an usher at church. I'm not I don't volunteer in some aspect. And can this still be a reality for me, that guy? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Well, there's the question for you, Mark.
Yeah, that's the question for me. And it's interesting you say that, because I believe, yes, that, no matter what my occupation is, I can be a part of building God's kingdom with all the people that I interact with from that vein of life, if you will. And I think in a lot of cases, and this isn't anything against the church, I think, there are many who use their occupation to bring others just as much as many pastors would, in a church setting. Mm-hmm. And that's nothing against those who work as pastors, don't get me wrong. But I think of it even with Paul, he hooked up with some other tent makers. Mm-hmm. And that was a part of his, ministry, that they would, kind of, be tent makers, and then they teach in the temple on the weekends, as part of who they were. And I for me, that is an aspect of, okay, yeah, my occupation is my current ministry. And that's not that's not minimizing those who are called to ministry, but I believe we're all called to a ministry. Mm-hmm. Versus the ministry, if you will. And I think that, I think it's important that Bob, Justin, Mark, Joe, Sue, that we don't lose sight of the fact that God is calling us to our own kingdom building right where we're at, whether it's cutting hair, teaching kids, that kind of thing. I believe everybody has their kingdom building opportunity, if you will, right where they're at. And that's the other part of it. I think this whole dynamic of, well, I think of teachers especially, and this governmental dynamic that basically says, we're not allowed to talk about Jesus in school, and I really feel for those people who are caught in that dynamic, because they feel that conflict and they feel that anxiety, if you will. Well, I can't share my faith. And it's like, I think there's going to come a day where it's going to be a lot more difficult for us to build the kingdom based on persecution, if you will. But I do think that's just another aspect of kingdoms in conflict. And I think, even in your question, it will likely be more difficult from my perspective for the average employer or business person to be able to do their business, in a Christian-like manner, or with a, very much open Jesus follower dynamic. And I think, we need right now is the time to be saying, okay, yeah, this may get more difficult, because I think there is a part where in our building of our kingdom, we can tend to forget that there are two kingdoms in conflict that are part of what we experience here on earth. There's God's kingdom and then Satan's kingdom. And those are very much opposed to one another. And I think, I don't want to go too far down that track, but that would be how I would walk through that, to where, I think there's going to be some shifting that occurs in the days that lie ahead, biblically speaking. And it's going to be important to be mindful of, okay, do I continue to build my kingdom here on earth and do what I need to be comfortable here? Or am I mindful that this isn't the end? And I'm thinking about God's kingdom and the future that lies ahead, and how I'm serving that in a way that is obedient versus comfort, because I think those two can be in conflict, but it's an indicator to me. Go ahead.
Yeah.
There's definitely some thoughts you want to challenge there, and that's okay too.
No, not challenge at all. Just, add too.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
1 Corinthians 10:31 says, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all for the glory of God. And we memorized that as a basketball team in high school. Cause my coach made us memorize that. We would say it before every game. And it was his way of saying, remember, when you go out on the basketball court, you're a reflection of the kingdom you're a part of, you know?
Sure.
And but I just think about that. There's two sides to that. There's the command side where we're meant to be obedient, which is I need to live my life in a way that can bring glory to God. But there's also the flip side that he's saying you can just eat and you can just drink and still bring me glory because I created you.
Sure.
And I built you exactly the way you were, and to drink the way you do and eat the way you do. And you know what I mean? That I don't think we often think about that side of it, is that he is pleased with our very existence. And we don't have to be standing on top of a, soapbox inside of the courtroom or whatever, or the what do you call that? The meeting room, right? At your corporate offices.
I gotcha. Yeah.
Conference room.
Room. There you go.
You don't have to be standing on a soapbox there preaching the gospel to bring him glory.
Sure.
You can just be a person of integrity. You can be a person who's supportive and loving. You can be someone who's kind and not, critical. You can be someone who's not competitive, but instead builds others up to your own detriment, right? Like, there's so many ways to build his kingdom that for people who are not evangelists, to still build his kingdom.
Sure.
And one of those ways is doing your craft well.
Sure.
And I think, again, often, I don't think that message gets preached often enough, which is doing your craft well. With that idea in mind that, like, I'm building this because I'm part of his kingdom and I'm doing it for his glory.
Sure.
Like, I think that brings him so much glory. He doesn't need you to be preaching. Now, if he's called you to, he does need you to, right? Like, there's a difference between callings, and I understand that. But I really think there are many people who are just blue-collar workers, have no interest in being in the choir or being an usher or preaching or, at Celebrate Recovery, teaching there every other Friday night or whatever that thing is. But they show up at work and they do their craft well, and they're a person of integrity, and they don't take the bait when they have opportunities to cheat or steal in one sense or another. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
and
I do.
think all of those things are opportunities to build his kingdom and to bring him glory versus only the special magical ones that are preaching or evangelizing or, you know what I mean?
I do.
And I think, like you said, as it becomes more difficult to preach using our words, it will become that much more important to know how to preach using our actions.
Sure.
And I think that's something that we take for granted now, I can just talk to them about Jesus. And I think sometimes we maybe lose track of the fact that our actions matter so much. And if you ever do get around to talking to them about Jesus, they are not interested because they've seen who you are in that context and in that context, and they don't align. So why should they trust anything you say, right? So all that being said, I think every one of us are called to do what we're called in the moment, whatever it is, whether you eat or drink, do it for the glory of God, And I also think about, like, the craftsmen that he talked about that built the temple and the tabernacle. There's no mention of their spirituality or how spiritual they were, and yet they are named in the Bible as being people of importance in the building of the most important building project of all history, the place where God's Spirit was going to dwell and meet, the kingdom. I think that's significant, right?
No doubt.
That there were people at that time that did their craft so well that only that single person in all the earth could do this job.
Sure.
And they did it immaculately, right? And it's talked about in the Bible. And I just think sometimes, again, we lose sight. We think about the priests and the Levites and the coats that they had to wear with all the stones, like just all of the process of the temple. And like we're trying to replace that with our modern day equivalents with pastors and whatever. but we forget about the craftsman who built the temple.
And it's interesting, the way you said that. Only one person on earth, and immaculate, Mary came to mind for me. You know, to where it's not even necessarily always about the craftsman, the blue collar worker, the executive. It's about kids.
Yes.
It's about teenagers.
That's good.
You know, it's about, you know, anyone who knows Christ. And at that point, they become part of this exponential kingdom.
You're in.
Yeah, you're in, and therefore you can begin to enter into this process of kingdom building, whether you're a 7-year-old, 17-year-old, or, you know, 70-year-old. You know, that I really appreciate what you bring from that. Every person has their component of the kingdom that they are able to build.
Yeah.
And even if I may, not in a guilt sense, but that every person has that opportunity to build.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of the people I think of, you know, growing up in life that I respect the most are those who probably themselves would say, "Oh, I'm nothing in the kingdom," and you know, "Oh, shucks," kind of thing. And yet they just live a life of integrity, and everyone knows it, and they're just a beautiful person. And you just look at them and go, "Man, I wish I could be like that person." You know, I don't think, "Man, I wish I could be like Mark Driscoll." You know what I mean? It's like, but you think of that kind of that humble person who goes to work and just shows up and is Jesus to everyone they meet, and you know what I mean?
I do.
That's just so laudable, and yet that person isn't thinking, "Oh, I'm, you know," all that. They're usually thinking the opposite. And I think there's something to be said for that humility, even if you are amazing at what you do, even if you are, you know, a great preacher or a great carver of stone, and you're gonna build something for the temple, whatever that, or you're a Mary, right? There's something about that humility of recognizing, "Oh, I'm part of this grand scheme, the kingdom. And I get to be part of that, and I'm going to work on this little corner of the kingdom, and that person's working on that corner." And you mentioned children too, and I don't know, we heard a message a few years back where he basically said, actually it was Pastor Troy, I don't know if he was quoting something or if this is something he researched, but he talked about Billy Graham's parents, right? What he ended up kind of bringing out of that was, some of you, you know, are called to be Billy Graham. Some of you are called to be Billy Graham's parents. And that just hit me in, like, square in the face. Like, wow. Like, my whole life I've been thinking about how, I've been thinking about doing ministry my whole life, and how I you know, just feel called, so to speak, and recognizing, like, I think sometimes I miss the forest for the trees. Like I think, "Oh, I need to be doing all that, the 99, when God said, "No, there's the one right in front of you, your children," you know, and you don't know that they're not going to 2x whatever you're doing. And you need to invest in that, right? Invest in your family as a parent, recognizing that might double the talents that God gave you when he comes back. And he goes, "Look at that. You got 3 kids. You 3x your return." And I'm like, "Well, what about the thing I did at Celebrate Recovery? And what about?" He's like, No. This is plenty, you know? And I think for me personally, sometimes that becomes a sobering reminder, and something that I now try to incorporate as a reminder in my life, you know, on a regular basis, of like, how are you treating this part of your kingdom, you know, like of his kingdom? How
are you stewarding your kingdom? The one that you've been given. No doubt.
But I really like the idea that we are given opportunities to be excellent at certain things. And like you said, sometimes it's parents, right? Like, the excellent example of a parent, and you look at them and go like, "Wow, I want to be a parent like that," you know. And sometimes it's crafting, you know, carving stone, and sometimes in my case, I like to think it's the code I write, you know, like I feel like I'm crafting it. I just really care about it, and I treat it as if I'm that guy, you know, preparing to build the temple. Like, that guy was really good because he had spent decades crafting, right? And building his craft, and even apprenticing before that. And so I like to think that the code I write's that way too. Whether I end up coding for the temple or not is not really the point, but just knowing that, like, that's a craft that I'm able to do for his glory, and it may or may not reflect on him the way I want it to, but I'm going to write it as if it does, if that makes sense.
Makes perfect sense. Yeah. Do everything you do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's just a really fun thought for me, because it's like, well, I don't have to be, like I said, out preaching. This matters too.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah. That life of integrity.
Yeah.
Is an important dynamic it's a dynamic opportunity we're given to be able to be mindful. And it's I appreciate your clarification, maybe even on some of my line thinking. Where is the line too far? But I think, it is for me personally, it is in that dynamic where I tend to shift from the bigger kingdom to my kingdom and what I want to do, or what I should be doing, but there is I want to recognize I believe there's a peace, if you will, that we can have when we're mindful that we're not just, but we're part of a kingdom that is moving on. It's not gonna stop. It's not going to end. And what I do, but still what I choose to do can make a difference. And I think that's, because it's not, if I'm starting to feel that anxiety, if I'm starting to feel that pressure, that competition, for me, I might need to pull back a little bit, because I think my focus has suddenly shifted, or not suddenly, but maybe over time shifted.
Yeah.
And I think, each life cycle stage is an opportunity for that to happen.
Yeah.
You bring up the kids, it's like, well, what do I do when I get to empty nest? Because in our audience, there's going to be people who, so what do I do with that transition? Because I'm not necessarily working on building my family so much. And now, and I have these extra resources, because I'm not, funding my children so much anymore, in that process. And it's just interesting to think about how I have this opportunity throughout my life to continue to reflect on whose kingdom I'm about, and what does that mean for me today?
For today,
yeah.
For this month and this year, and
yeah,
it's good. Yeah, I think one last final thought for me, too, is I think in the last couple of years I've really been trying to figure out the balance between, so like doing worship, for instance, you are up on a stage in front of people, and there is an aspect to doing your instrument well, and whether that's your voice or your actual instrument. And so there is this desire to do it well. But in that desire to do it well, it's like this reflection process of, did I do it well or not? And sometimes you say, yes, I did it well. And it becomes difficult to remember why you're up there. It can become difficult to remember why you're up there, and instead be focused on the sound instead of the spirit, right?
Sure.
And I think one of the things I've been slowly, learning is this thing that God uses that too. And it is the same answer as all the other things, which is continually remembering what kingdom I'm about. So I want my voice to sound better, but I want it to sound better for his kingdom. You know what I mean? And remembering that. And that, it might sound like, even like unbelievable to some people, like, oh, you just, it's about your own kingdom. It's like, well, yes, it's both. And I think that's part of it. You know what I mean? I think when we bring glory to him, there's going to be very many times where it also brings us a certain amount of credibility and us a certain amount of effervescent or whatever, like it.
accolades.
It's supposed to set us apart. It's supposed to make us, you think of the Daniels in the Bible, you think of Joseph. When we do what God wants us to do, there's a good chance we're going to stand out in a good way. So just remembering, like, that's part of this whole equation, and you still have to put that on the altar too, and like say, okay, I see that now I'm getting more accolades, or I'm not, or so, maybe they didn't like what my singing sounded like. And does that matter for the kingdom? Okay, no, because I think I'm still called to do this. So I'm going to keep working on my craft, keep working on what I do, regardless of whether that person dislikes it or this person said I did an amazing job. It's not about either of those things, even though this one feels good and this one hurts really bad. You know what I mean?
I do. Yeah. Continuing in the faithfulness with the opportunity you've been given, and doing that to the best of your ability with for God's glory, not being caught up in the perfection. Yeah. Just being in the obedience, I think, is
And recognizing that there's a chiseling that's happening, right? Like,
sure.
When I, like, for instance, the singing thing, and so, you hear enough accolades, then pride is very easy to come right in. And so a few critiques here and there is a good opportunity to chisel some of that pride away and go, you're not all that. Yes. You know what I mean? And I think that's a balance that's important. And I don't want to need that balance. I want to just be humble, but I recognize the reality too of, like, I'm human and the flesh is easily wooed.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think it are those who may have the chisel are quite often the people who have gone before us and know the shortfalls maybe at times to avoid, or did you ever think about doing it this way? And that becomes a part of our learning to be able to do what we do better as craftsmen for the kingdom. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Thanks for sharing, Justin.
Thank you for sharing.
This is how we see it.
Hey, thank you for listening to our podcast. If you like How I See It, please do all the things that podcasts tell you to do. Subscribe, rate, review, follow us, and or talk nicely about us on social media. If you want to reach out, the email is us@howiseeit.click. Yep, I said .click, as in .click. Please tell your friends about this show, and we'll see you on the next one.